Welcome to this explainer. I want you to close your eyes for a second and imagine you're standing in a massive, roaring stadium. The lights are blindingly bright, the grass is that perfect, vibrant green, and tens of thousands of fans are cheering so loudly you can literally feel it vibrating in your chest. They call it the beautiful game, and, on the surface, it absolutely is. It's packed with passion, joy, and childhood dreams. But today, we're going to look past that bright, glamorous surface. We're going to pull back the curtain and explore the hidden, darker side of the sport. Because behind the famous names and the shining million-dollar trophies, there is an entire history of blood, crime, and power that the cameras rarely show us.
So that brings us to the really big question we're exploring today. Did football ever actually change, or did it just learn how to hide? As we trace the evolution of this sport, we're going to constantly contrast that surface-level beauty with some deeply hidden underlying stories. I want you to keep that question right in the back of your mind as we go through today's explainer.
All right, let's quickly map out our journey. We'll kick things off with from battles to boardrooms, then move into hooligans and stadium tragedies. After that, we'll uncover the business of corruption, address racism and player trafficking, and finally, wrap up with the modern game's shadows.
Part 1. From battles to boardrooms.
To really understand this dark history, we have to go way, way back to medieval England. Football wasn't a structured sport back then. It was honestly closer to a town-wide brawl. There were no rules, absolutely no referees, and hundreds of people would literally fight to move a ball across a village. I mean, we're talking broken bones and even death. It was so chaotic that English kings like Edward II, Edward III, Richard II, and Henry IV repeatedly tried to ban it entirely. But jump forward to 1863 and we see a massive shift. A group of wealthy, educated men met up in a London pub called the Freemasons' Tavern to establish the official rules. This was the birth of modern football. But notice what happened there. The power shifted. It moved away from the ordinary folks in the streets and into the hands of men of influence. And that very meeting set the stage for the massive, corporate, multi-billion-dollar business that would eventually become the Premier League in 1992.
Now, as the game became a highly structured business, it created this brilliant, glamorous illusion. On one hand, you have the beautiful game we all know, the passion, the trophies, the joy. But on the exact opposite side, completely masked by that new structure, a shadow was growing. Almost as soon as the ink was dry on those new rules, clubs started secretly breaking them. They were making illegal, under-the-table payments to players to guarantee wins, and fueling deep, sometimes incredibly violent local rivalries.
Which leads us to Section 2, Hooligans and Stadium Tragedies.
This is where that deep club loyalty turned into literally organized violence. From the 1960s right through the 1980s, hooliganism wasn't just random anger, not at all. These were highly organized gangs of young men, and they were often coming from marginalized, broken communities that were experiencing terrible poverty and high unemployment. They formed what they called firms with pretty intimidating names like the Headhunters, the Intercity Firm, and the Bushwhackers. For these young men, football was the one place in society where they felt powerful. They planned out their fights, caused utter chaos in towns across England, and eventually they exported that organized violence all across Europe.
And tragically, that violence culminated in some deeply painful moments. 39. That is the number of people who died on May 29, 1985 at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels. Liverpool was playing Juventus in the European Cup final. But before the match even started, English fans attacked Italian fans. As terrified people tried to escape, they were crushed against a wall that ultimately collapsed. 39 people, who just went out to watch a football match, lost their lives that night. It resulted in a 5-year ban from European football for all English clubs, and it cast a long, dark shadow over the entire sport.
Just 4 years later, we hit another devastating number, 97. On April 15, 1989, at the Hillsborough Stadium in England, a catastrophic failure by police authorities caused a fatal crush during an FA Cup semi-final. 97 people lost their lives. But what makes this specific part of football's dark history even more agonizing is what happened next. For 30 years, the truth was deliberately hidden. Police authorities lied, they blamed the victims, and newspapers printed those exact lies as facts. It took 3 agonizing decades of fighting by the victims' families for the world to finally acknowledge the truth. This was a horrific failure of the authorities, not the fans.
Moving on to Section 3, the business of corruption. So, the 1990s roll around. A massive influx of television money floods the sport, and a totally new, invisible rot takes hold. Take FIFA, for example, the organization that controls global football. For decades, a lot of people suspected that the men in suits were making highly corrupt decisions, basically handing out World Cup hosting rights to countries with absolutely no football tradition just because they were paid off. Well, in 2015, the world finally saw the truth. American authorities actually arrested several high-ranking FIFA officials, exposing hundreds of millions of dollars in secret bribes. The corruption was incredibly real, it ran unbelievably deep, and it proved that the system right at the very top was entirely broken.
But it wasn't just happening in the boardrooms. The action on the pitch wasn't always authentic either. Match fixing is when the results or specific events of a game are secretly decided and paid for before the whistle even blows. Just imagine cheering your heart out for a goal, entirely unaware that the outcome of the match had already been purchased by a criminal syndicate. It completely and utterly destroys the illusion of fair competition.
Think about how these mechanics actually operate on the ground. A player might be secretly paid to purposely miss a penalty kick. A goalkeeper might make a deliberate, clumsy mistake. Or a referee could hand out a totally unjustified red card. And who profits from all this? Illegal gambling networks and massive criminal organizations. This is a global infection, guys. It even snared the hugely famous Italian club Juventus during the massive 2006 Calciopoli scandal, where powerful officials were actually caught secretly arranging exactly which referees would work their matches.
Let's turn to Section 4, Racism and Player Trafficking.
We really need to look at the deep human costs embedded in the sport's massive global expansion. Systemic racism in football is, quite frankly, a wound that is old and it has not fully healed. Back in the 1970s and 80s, black and minority players stepping onto the pitch across Europe were met with thousands of people shouting unimaginably cruel abuse. And for years, football authorities just looked away. They literally told players to just stay professional. While there are definitely stricter laws and campaigns today, this toxic behavior still reappears in stadiums, it's rampant in online abuse, and it lingers in the quiet, closed-door decisions about who actually gets to manage these top clubs.
Then, there's the truly heartbreaking reality of illegal player trafficking. Right behind all those glamorous headlines about multi-million-dollar transfer markets, there's a deeply exploitative system that specifically targets vulnerable children.
Here is how this terrible cycle actually operates. Step 1. Completely unregulated agents approach poor families in places like Africa or South America, promising a much better life for their talented child. And we're talking about kids sometimes as young as 9 years old. Step 2. The child is moved all the way to Europe. Step 3. If the club decides the child isn't going to be the next global superstar, they are just dropped. And finally, Step 4, which is the most tragic part. The child is simply abandoned in a foreign country with absolutely no money and no legal papers. And despite FIFA's modern regulations trying to stop this, the immense global demand for cheap young talent just keeps this cruel cycle turning.
Finally, Section 5, the modern game's shadows.
Bring this explainer right up to the present day. Astronomical wealth has introduced some really complex new dynamics, and this brings us to the concept of sports washing. Today, we're seeing state-owned clubs, teams effectively bought and run by entire governments, spending billions of euros. The strategy here isn't necessarily about making a traditional financial profit. Instead, the sport is being used to alter how the world perceives these nations, essentially distracting global attention away from their domestic human rights records.
And sports washing isn't the only modern shadow we're dealing with. The contemporary game is also grappling with massive carbon footprints, thanks to endless global travel and private jets. We're seeing a heavy saturation of gambling companies acting as primary sponsors, openly targeting vulnerable populations. Furthermore, there is an intense, frankly crushing, mental health pressure placed on very young players who have to live their entire lives in the completely unforgiving spotlight of global social media.
So, what is the crucial takeaway from all this? The shadows of the past haven't disappeared, they've simply taken new shapes. We've journeyed all the way from medieval street brawls and the organized chaos of hooligan firms, through the profound, devastating grief of stadium tragedies. We've looked at corrupt officials taking secret bribes, and right up to the modern complexities of sports washing and player exploitation. To truly understand the world, we have to look past the beautiful goals to acknowledge this full, honest history.
I want to leave you with this one thought. Knowing the full story, can you still look at the beautiful game the exact same way? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it empowers you to keep seeking the deeper truths hiding right behind the everyday illusions of the things we love. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next one.